Hi everyone, artist Elizabeth Whelan here on the sandbar, which is Chappaquiddick Island, here to talk to you today about composition. So composition is the arrangement of the subject matter in your artwork, and of course that also applies to photography and filmmaking. You can use the arrangement of the objects in your scene to help convey your idea. Now, when people talk about your idea or your concept, what they mean is whatever captivated you about the scene that you're looking at, or whatever concept you're trying to communicate through your artwork. For example, an atmosphere of peace or an atmosphere of tension, that sort of thing. So here's some tips and tricks to get a nice balanced composition. And during the course of the talk today, there will be 3 opportunities for you to stop and pause the video and do a little sketch of your own. Now, this doesn't have to be anything major. This is just something you could even do, you know, with a ballpoint pen on the back of an envelope. But if you do have a sketchbook, it might be useful to have it. Let's give this a start. So, 2 types of composition. Most of the time, it's either scenes or concepts that you build yourself, such as still life that you arrange, or a posed figure, or something out of your imagination, something that you put together. It could be from different pieces of reference material, and you've decided to arrange them in a certain way for your finished painting or drawing, or it could be just a scene that you happen upon in real life, and you have to deal with whatever's in that scene at that moment. So what I call the very best composition trick, and you'll hear me talk about this in every type of drawing and painting that I do, it's called Notan. So Notan comes from a Japanese concept of the harmonious balance between light and dark. And the way I use it is to describe looking at a scene and breaking it down into only dark and light components, and then looking at that arrangement and saying, is this a dynamic arrangement? Is this interesting to me? What I then do is, during the course of my drawing or painting, I keep referring back to that Notan to give me that same sense of drama. I don't always treat everything in the entire painting with the same depth of light and dark, the same type of value range. Obviously, I want some more subtlety in my finished piece, but this is a very good way to get started. So when I look at a scene, I try to identify the patterns of light and dark in order to get to a good composition. And one thing that you might want to try yourself is, as you're looking at artwork created by other people, particularly in museums or famous artwork, have a look at their work and see what they did to really emphasize the dark and light patterns to make a more dramatic painting, and or to pull your eye around that painting. So now it's time to choose your scene and make some sketches. And your scene can be anything at all. It can be your coffee cup sitting on the table. But whatever catches your eye, say you're out and about and you see something, and for some reason it really attracts you, and you say, hey, whatever that is, I would really like to draw or paint that. So take a second and think about why. What is it about that scene that caught your imagination? And in your sketchbook, do a very small thumbnail Notan, just like you saw the examples before, where you look at that particular scene and you decide where the darks are and where the lights are. The way to find that, and this is the best trick ever, is to squint. If you squint at the scene, eliminating all the detail, just looking through your eyelashes basically, you will be able to see a pattern of light and dark. Now that can also help you when it comes to deciding what sort of scene you'd like to have. And I'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about landscape. What you want to do after you've done your little Notan is then draw a larger and a little bit more detailed sketch that has a bit more information in it about what's actually going on. As you do this, you're going to want to edit your scene, take out things that really don't apply, or move things around, maybe add something in. And I find it very useful to write down descriptive words that have to do with the scene I'm looking at. And these words will help guide you through making your artwork. So those words can have something to do with like mysterious, dark, um, rocky, or it can be light, powerful, you know, any sort of descriptive word that comes to mind. All right, here's an example of mine, just so you see what I'm talking about. Here's a sketchbook of mine, and you can see that I saw this scene on the way to New York on the train, and I decided I'd like to do a painting of it eventually. For the moment, not having time to do a painting, I did a tiny, tiny little Notan. You can see that up in the corner, a little light and dark impression of what I was looking at. And then I did a larger sketch, and this is based off a photo that's on my phone. So I eliminated a lot and decided what did I want to have, you know, what was I looking for? And when I actually do the painting, I'll look back at that Notan, which has a little bit more information about dark areas and light areas, whereas the sketch has more detail about what I'd like to include and what I wouldn't like to include. And I'm going to look at that, and I'm also going to look at these notes that I took. So I wrote some things down about this scene. At the time of day, it was quiet and surreal and very still. Activity had ceased. It wasn't abandoned, but it was very, very quiet. The evening was coming in, so I've got, you know, low light on the scene, and that's why I've got some pretty dramatic shadows going on. And there were two towers in the background, and it brought to mind minarets, for example, and you know, the call of the muezzin for evening prayer, that sort of thing. When we hear about those sorts of scenes occurring, for some reason, and I don't quite know why, this scene reminded me of that. So these words that you write down automatically, you don't even have to really analyze them. These are just the things that came to your mind and struck you, because for some reason, all of those sentiments come together to create this idea that you can then take forth to your painting. And as you're painting, you can ask yourself, okay, you know, is what I'm doing in color actually representing those ideas of what struck me at the moment? And of course, you can make decisions about, you know, oh, I'd really like it to be more like this or more like that. But these words and these sketches and the Notan will help you make those decisions. So another thing I also decide at that time is, do I want a vertical or a horizontal orientation? Do I want it to be a square? All of this stuff kind of conveys a different sense about a scene. You know, if you do a vertical piece that's just sort of a slice of something where you're targeting maybe just those two towers, that might be a completely different looking arrangement and a different looking drawing or painting than the wider scene that we're traveling through on the train tracks. So all of those things are the kind of ideas to keep in mind as you're working. Now I've got a few early examples of mine to show you of landscape painting and that sort of thing. And I'm showing you these earlier paintings because I want you to know that as artists progress, and I've been painting now for about 10 years, that we become more sophisticated and do things a little bit differently and perhaps with a bit more nuance and maybe a bit more complexity than we did when we were starting off. And I want to show you how I started off because I want you to see the path you can take. And here we have a small painting I did for a golf course. They actually had commissioned me to do basically a series of paintings, one representing every hole on the golf course, and they used that for their membership book every year. They hired a different artist every year to do this, which was really cool. So I saw this scene, and this is the small painting that I did from that scene. But when I first looked at it, the Notan that I made lacked some punch. I mean, it's kind of this strange sort of L shape, angle shape. It didn't really do much. So when I looked at the scene, I decided that I would take some of the midtones I saw that weren't really light and weren't really dark, and I would kind of push them a little bit darker than I saw in the scene so that they really kind of trended towards the dark. So if you squint at the painting, you can sort of see a dark pattern that reflects that second sketch, even though everything in the Notan isn't necessarily interpreted as dark or light. Some of it was interpreted as a midtone, but it helped me understand what I needed to do to have a more interesting painting than my first impression of this scene. So even when it's something very quiet like this and very still, you can use Notan and the idea of light and dark to add just a little bit more punch to it. And here's another one of the holes on that same golf course. And I probably painted these about 6 years ago, something like that. So when I looked at the scene, I said, hey, this is kind of cool. You know, got the sand pit here. I don't know a lot about golf, I have to tell you. And then the row of trees at the back, which I thought were kind of neat too, and some, you know, clouds going through. But I felt once again that this scene needed something else. And I had taken some pictures of crows that were all over the golf course at this particular time of day. And I decided to take one of those guys and put him in this scene, which I thought added a lot. So just to kind of test out where should he go? Up in the sky, you know, over to the side, whatever. In the Notan, I added where I thought a crow might go. And I said to myself, oh, I like the way that's kind of anchored to the darks. It sort of pulls your eye through a little bit. And that's how I went ahead with the painting of this particular scene. So I used the Notan idea to help me decide, you know, is this going to be balanced? Will the contrast balance? I would like to point out also that if you look at this scene and squint, you really could put all of that green grass into the same, you know, you could throw that all into the dark bucket, couldn't you? You know, you could say, okay, the sand pit's a light and the sky is light, but the greens and the background are dark. I decided I wanted to differentiate between the two. I wanted to be able to make the green grass as light or whatever color I felt like within the lighter greens, and have the trees along the back kind of anchor the design. Otherwise, I would feel that I had to make the grass a certain amount of darkness, which wouldn't really help with the sense of distance and atmosphere that I was after. I hope I explained that well. But so when you do a Notan and when you squint and when you see things as dark, there are going to be those objects which you know for sure are the darks, no doubt about it, shadows, etc. And those things you know are the lights, like the clouds or whatever in this scene. And then you, the artist, get to make the decisions as to where everything else goes according to what you think would make a good design. And this is an important process to go through because it gives you a different way of looking at the scene rather than just going, okay, that's a nice sand pit, I'm going to paint that. It gives you a chance to analyze and go, okay, can I make this a bit more interesting or do something else with it? All right, now here's your first exercise. Composition exercise number 1. So here's a scene that is the cliffs at Aquina here on Martha's Vineyard. And I would like you to pause this video and make a tiny little Notan sketch. You're going to squint at this scene and decide what's light and what's dark, and does that make a pleasing arrangement? So you're just going to do something about 2 inches. You know, it can be just scribble it with a pen if you want to. And when you're finished, you can ask yourself, is this a pleasing design to me? And you can decide yourself whether the cliffs belong in the lights or the darks, whether the water and all of those stones up front belong in the lights and darks. This is your artwork, and you can edit as needed. You may decide you really want to concentrate only on the foreground, and to heck with the cliffs. So these are the choices you get to make as an artist. This is your interpretation of the scene. If you want it to look exactly like a camera shot, you can use a camera for that. But when you're creating your own artwork, that's the time to use your eye. And when you look at this and go, hey, you know, maybe it's the cliffs I like more than the stuff up front. Or you go, wow, I really like the green that goes over the top, you know, that undulating feel of all of that mossy stuff. I want my drawing or painting to be about that. Your decision completely. How much of the scene, where it goes, and the Notan part. So if you are ready to move to the next slide, we'll go ahead and do so. If you want to stop and pause for a bit and do a little sketching, I highly encourage it. Okay, another tip. Use camera images as only one form of reference. The reason I want you to do Notans and sketches, and in fact, if at some point you did do a Notan of the scene we just looked at and you want to go back and make a small sketch of it, I highly recommend it, something with a bit more detail. Anything that gets your eye warmed up and used to looking at things is definitely good. So in this particular case, here's a photograph taken of me in my studio. And what you can see is, sure, there's the scene, but if you look at the angles, for example, the side of the windows and then the side of the easel as it goes over, there's camera distortion. Now you'll see that some people just incorporate that in their painting, and you can tell quite easily when someone's just used a photograph and plonked it right in the painting like that. Sometimes on purpose, and sometimes because they didn't really think it through. I am strongly suggesting that you use your camera as reference whenever you feel like it, nothing wrong with that, but also make your own sketches in Notan and use those as opportunities to correct for camera distortion. So if I'm not actually in place and I had a photograph like this and I wanted to make a painting or a drawing from it, I would decide, okay, I'm going to correct for distortion. I am perhaps going to eliminate things that I see in there and add others. For example, maybe I'd take the cat bed that's in the corner out of the photo. So, or I might decide to cut off one of the windows, who knows. But I would probably also straighten the lines and check and correct perspective as I go. So, cameras and photography are wonderful, but your sketches and your notes that you take about the scene and about things that you want to convey are just, if not more, important. All right, another tip. So if you're creating your own composition, your own still life, for example, variety really does help. Now, for every rule or tip, there is somebody doing something completely different. So, just take these as gentle hints, but certainly not anything that you're tied into. But if you're not quite sure how to put together a still life, this is your first time trying to do it, or if you're really stuck, variety of objects. Here I've got something conical, something square or cube, a sphere or something round. You can decide that you'd like to look at those objects from a distance. You can decide you'd like to zoom in and just do, a cropped image. You can arrange them by separating them or grouping them. Sometimes if you've got three things, grouping two and having one off to the side is a nice balance. It's asymmetrical, but it's still balanced. So there are lots of different options and things to play around with, but usually a variety of shapes helps. Now later on I'm going to show you some compositions where the shapes are more uniform, so you can see how that works as well. But this is a good way to start off. All right, Winslow Homer. Here are a couple of pages from his sketchbooks. I love showing people artwork done by artists past and present. And one thing that's really interesting is we think about Winslow Homer, you might think of some of the artwork you might have seen in a museum. He did a lot of scenes of Americana, scenes of the Civil War, and also amazing seascapes, waves crashing over rocks and that kind of thing. But he also kept sketchbooks. And I am a big fan of people keeping sketchbooks, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot, because it's a place for us to put our ideas, our notes, and if we see a little scene that we might eventually want to do something else with, it's a place to put that. At the same time, little sketches and notebooks are just fun, even if that's as far as you ever take it. So I wanted to show you these two pages in particular, because even a landscape can contain also things that are vertical, things that are round, things that are rectangular, which is sort of like this church steeple and a small cottage and the roundness of the trees. Or this other scene down here on the left, with the trees sort of extending up, then you've got this nice sweep going around the edge, and you've got the little windmill in the background. Both of these use that Notan concept, don't they? I mean, if you just imagine him sitting out there in the field or whatever and looking at the scene, he has chosen where the darks and lights are going to go and where you might find them in a painting if he followed these to a painting as well. So this is just a concept, the Notan and the sketch idea, and looking for the darks and lights in your scene are a way to get to a successful composition regardless of what it is that you're trying to sketch or draw. So this is another early piece of mine. I really try not to litter these talks with my own artwork so much, but in the composition case, I've got a few examples to show you, just because I want you to see sort of how I got started. So this was my first still life painting, and I went for a pretty safe composition, but it's still very balanced. It's got a unity of color. It's got interesting different forms. I've got sort of a triangular thing going on at the back there with those objects in the glass. I've got this interesting looking vase and the shapes of that, and I have the little figurine, and I call it keeping an eye on the cat because there's a little cat painted on that bowl down there, and if you look at the painting in real life, you can see that the direction of the figurine's eyes are looking right down at that cat face. So I think if I were to paint this today, I would probably add a bit more drama, maybe a little bit more dark in the background, maybe some other objects, that go off the side of the canvas or things of that nature. But this is a decent, solid start. And there's nothing wrong with starting with just, hey, I know this works. I don't care if it is not the thing that's going to hang in the Louvre. It's my painting. It has objects in that have some meaning to me. I like this painting and I still have it up on my wall. And I thought it was a good start. So every painting is not going to be a masterpiece. Every sketch is not going to be a masterpiece. But I want you to go ahead and do them anyway, because it isn't until you have a number of sketches and paintings behind you that you can start really analyzing what you do and don't do in your own work and start to improve and say, okay, well, next time I'm going to try this. But if you're always waiting for that one moment where you do everything perfectly, it's never going to happen. So just get started. All right, here's another painting looking back a little bit. This is Paul Cézanne, fruit bowl, glass, and apples. So a nice arrangement brought together by a variety of different objects, the fruit in the bowl. He's got the knife leading you sort of off the canvas, something interesting going on in the background, nicely folded fabric. So even if you're just using the most mundane household objects, you can still arrange things in a pleasing composition. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do just what Paul Cézanne did. What is pleasing to you is most important. We all actually have an ability to compose sketches and drawings much better than we think we do, because we are already used to arranging things in our lives on a constant basis. Everything from setting out the table, how you have stuff in your closet, how you have things around your home. Now, of course, you might say, well, my home's a complete chaos. Well, in that case, that's your personal style. So we all have ways of looking at and arranging objects, and we just have to take that same sense into our artwork. I think what happens is people go, gosh, I've got a piece of paper and I'm going to put that object smack in the middle. And then when they do that, sometimes it works, and sometimes you're left with the idea, kind of like I was after doing my still life, going, okay, well, that wasn't bad, but how do I make this more interesting? So that's when things like, right here we have fruit bowl, glass, and apples. There is enough going on in this scene. The reds of the apples lead your eye around. You've got the knife going off the edge. Everything isn't centered. Some things are going off the edge of the canvas. So there are lots of ways to make even everyday objects look interesting. And it's just a matter of playing around a bit. Sometimes it's a matter of saying, hey, I'm going to crop that scene I was doing smaller. I'm going to make it much smaller and lop off all the stuff happening on the side. And that's where the Notan and the small sketch comes in very useful. In this particular case, if you squint and look at this scene, you see a really nice contrast between the lights and the darks. You can really see how that Notan concept comes into effect. If everything was muted in all the same shades, if there weren't value differences, in other words, light and dark differences, it would not be as successful a painting. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're going along, watching out for those lights and darks, making scenes the way you would like to, but also looking for making them as interesting as possible visually. Okay, so I mentioned before that I was going to show you something where it wasn't a cone and a circle and a cube or whatever. And here we have piles of books. So one artist who I couldn't find who they were, unfortunately, and then this other fellow, an Irish artist named Kevin Miller, used books. And they're actually, if you Google paintings of books, they're an extraordinary number. So these are just some I selected because I liked them. This person decided to set up compositions for themselves. These are small paintings. All of them are small paintings. I mean, really small paintings. Using piles of books, which are actually quite uniform in size, but arranging them differently. In some cases, they stay in the middle of the painting. In some cases, they go off the side of the painting, using color to make them sort of interesting. So there is no one formula for coming up with a really good composition, but you can unify by theme. You can use color to lead your eye around. For example, if you look at those, that pile of books with the one red book at the bottom in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see there's a teeny tiny dot of an orangey red color near the top, just enough to pull your eye up there. Whereas if that wasn't there, you might not actually, your eye might be drawn to the red and not go any further. So little things like that, when it comes to doing the color version of your work, are really worth thinking about. Okay, I don't know, unfortunately, the names of the artists who did all of these eggplants. They're different people, but I thought this was kind of fun to show you how you could take any object whatsoever and do something interesting with it. So whether it's one eggplant, two eggplants, eggplants plus stuff, five eggplants, you can make a good composition from them. If you squint and look at these, each one of them has some interesting factor to them. In some cases using the shadows, in some cases using the arrangement of the darks and the lights, in some cases pulling in other objects. So it doesn't matter. Eggplant, anything can be an interesting composition with just a little bit of thought. And here we have this piece by Tom Nachreiner. And I love this because of its enthusiasm and vibrance. And you might look at that and go, well, where are the darks? You know, I don't see any black or dark brown or dark blue or whatever. So what Tom has done in this is he has basically assigned all of his midtone colors and midtone values to the darks. Because if you squint at this, what you see is all of the color then becomes the darks, and then the white flowers and the white tablecloth become the lights. And you have a very dynamic design that way. He sort of interplayed the one into the other in a really wonderful way, and those active brush strokes are fantastic. Plus all of that color. So there are no, you don't have, when I say darks, it doesn't have to be like black. You don't have to necessarily see black. Your midtone colors can act as a dark if your scene is keyed towards the high end of the brighter colors rather than it being a darker scene. And here we have another example that's kind of similar, Tom Brown's still life. But in this case, what he's done is he's taken these lighter mid-tone objects and really anchored them with the dark shadows running behind. So if you squint and look at this, you definitely see a path of darks leading through the various different objects that he has out there, even though they're just regular, sort of mundane objects. Nicely painted, though. All right, I thought I'd throw some more stuff in that's a little bit different. In this case, we've got pets. So I figured, what do you have around you that you can practice on in terms of Notan and sketches? And that really is still life. It's maybe looking out the window and seeing the landscape. And it's also perhaps animals, if you have an animal. So here's an example of how to do a composition when you only have one object. In this particular case, this lovely little cat, from the reference material I had to make a decision. Do I want to put in all the background and such, or do I just want to concentrate on the cat? And because the idea was this was sort of a memorial painting of this particular animal that had quite a personality, I decided to eliminate the background, just really have a pattern back there and have all of the accent be on the cat herself. I think she's a her. And so I did two little sketches. These are actually, the sketches are actually probably about 6 by 8, not as small as you see on the screen here, but two different poses, both of which I felt were, you know, well anchored and would work nicely for the small painting. I think it's about 9 by 12, something like that. And so the client went with the one on the right. And I had so much fun painting that. And here's of course, we have to keep it even. Here's a dog. And once again, I did three different sketches based on reference material that was given to me. And, different poses, different kind of atmosphere. One very much at rest, one a little bit more alert, and one ready to play. So the client went with the one in the upper left-hand corner, which I was so pleased about because it made a really lovely and touching painting of a dog who was no longer with the family. So, I think when you're painting an animal, and particularly when you're sort of memorializing a long life of a beloved family member, you do want to think about atmosphere and personality. And in this particular case, I really liked the feeling from this particular pose of the dog with all of his toys. But also, if you squint and look at this, you've got the dark background sort of showing off his paler fur, and then I still have the ground at the front quite light. I didn't want to put that dark as well, but it still is a little bit darker than the fur of the dog, so that the emphasis is on the dog. So you can use your lights and darks in a subtle way. Just because you did the Notan in such a way that there was high contrast doesn't mean that that's exactly how you have to end up doing the painting. But it does help make the decision that you would definitely want your subject matter lit in a certain way or not lit in a certain way, depending on what it is that you're trying to convey. So I thought I'd throw a bird in as well. And this is a pheasant that used to live on a farm that I helped caretake for a number of years. And we called him the vicar because of his white neck there. And he liked to hang out in the vegetable garden in the asparagus ferns. And then at the end of the day, he would leave the garden and go to wherever it was that he stayed. So I decided to do a painting of him called The Vicar Heads Home. Now, in this particular case, this is a good example of a what would you call it? Very unbalanced subject. Here he is, a kind of a fat bird and this super, super long tail that is actually longer than the painting. So I decided to use that as an actual compositional technique to sort of show him in motion by having part of him still out of the frame and having a little distance for him to be heading towards in order to get that idea that he was sort of marching along and we were watching him go through, sort of as if you would on a comic book panel, which actually is a good example. Comic book artists have to think of composition for every different frame they put together in an entire comic book. And they have to think about things like this, about how do you convey action? How does a single object, how do you show a single object in such a way to make it look as if some activity is going on? And in this case, I also tried to use the shadows that I could see around him to help give a little bit of balance to the scene overall. And speaking of single objects, I think most artists at some point or another have done flowers in a vase, because why not? I mean, flowers are just fantastic and the shapes are so alluring. So I thought I'd show you these examples by Edouard Manet, and both of them are really, I mean, they're very direct, aren't they? The objects are in the middle of the canvas, and the various different fronds or the various different blossoms arch out across, but you can tell that he enjoyed painting them. They were sort of explorations in design and contrast. Each one of these has a very strong design sense. You can really see from the Notan point of view, the one on the left, obviously very easy to see where the darks and the lights are. And the one on the right, the same way, because of that background being grayed and the vase and the flowers being lighter in value in front. Both of these just are wonderful, and they're very peaceful scenes. So whereas you can use something like a technique like I did with the pheasant, where there's action and activity going on, it's the end of the day, the vicar's walking home, you've got a lot of dark. Manet, in these paintings, was painting a peaceful and serene scene. So there isn't a lot of weird stuff going on, a lot of complexity, a lot of angst. We're not pulled in but so close to the scene. They're just really beautiful, well-balanced compositions. I did want to mention something about plein air painting because often we're traveling around or doing whatever, and we come across a scene that we think is just really beautiful, and we say to ourselves, oh, I'd like to sketch or draw it. And the very first problem is, well, what do I sketch or draw? You know, what's going on in this particular scene, and how can I make it look interesting? So there are a couple of ways to go about it. One is sometimes people will take a little viewfinder. So this is a little plastic doohickey right here where you can, you can make a rectangular, vertical or horizontal or vertical shape, or you can make it more square to decide as you look around what should be in your scene. And to begin with, this is a good way to go about doing things. I also, sometimes I'll just take a 3x5 card with a rectangular, if I've got a rectangular canvas, I'll take a little rectangular scene like this and just use it to help identify. So when I'm doing that, I'm looking around for part of the scene that has some good contrast in it, something interesting going on that'll make a nice sketch or a nice oil painting. And then I will usually on another 3x5 card or in a sketchbook, I'll do the little Notan and the sketch, of course, because although you want to get to kind of the dessert of actually painting, you'll have a lot more fun if it's really going to be a well-designed painting and that you don't decide halfway through that you really should have moved the scene a little bit. So if you make a decision and go, hey, okay, that's pretty good. There may be 3 other scenes that I see out here, but I'm going to paint this one. Do a little sketch, figure out what is and isn't going to go in, and then go from there. So in this particular case, I decided I wanted to have this kind of dark shape running through the painting. And even though there were other things that were dark in the scene, I wasn't quite sure, do I want those to be real darks or not? But I knew that one angle and the little farmhouse, I knew I wanted to have some contrast there. So I decided to start that way and establish the darks first. Okay, here I am going a little bit further along. Now, in this particular case, I've decided that the foreground, I don't want to have many darks in at all. I really do want to keep everybody's concentration on what was going on further in the distance. And it's difficult. You're out there, the sun's beating down, you feel a certain amount of pressure because the shadows are moving, because the sun is moving. There might be bugs biting you, all the fun of plein air painting. So to have anything that can help you at the start, even if that sketch is just as quick as possible, just so that you know what you're trying to get to, allows you to push the scene as far as possible. And sometimes you may finish it back in the studio, or likewise, you may take a couple of photos, which will, I promise, look different than what you're seeing in front of you, which is what makes that little sketch and the work that you've done so important. So I'm going to try to hold this up to the camera. And so this was the finished painting. You can sort of, let's see, there we go. So you can see that by the time, now in actual fact, it does have more of the yellow greens in it that you see in the photograph in situ. So it's just the webcam is distorting that just a little bit. But you can see that I kept those darks and I kept that contrast, even though it became more modulated as the painting went on. And that was really my first real plein air painting. So you've seen a lot of my beginning paintings today, but I wanted to show you these things because it is important to understand where artists started from and how they got going. And everything doesn't always go perfectly. For example, on that little painting, there are some things that if I were to do it today, I would probably do a little bit differently. But when I finished it, I said to myself, you know what? That's a pretty good start. I'm just going to call it a day. And instead of continuing to work on this one and possibly messing it up, I decided to stop. And then the next day I went out with a different canvas to a different location and did something else. So there is no need to try to go for the perfect composition, the perfect piece of artwork every time. If you get yourself to a point where you feel that you have painted or completed a drawing to a successful degree, stop working on it, sign it, and then the next time go on to something else. Because this is how we amass knowledge and experience, is through practice and observation. And that is something I tell people all the time, the students I have, people in workshops. It is observation and practice that leads to mastery. So there is no need to put pressure on yourself to create a masterpiece every single time you go plein air painting, every time you sit down with your sketchbook. Most of the stuff is not going to be all that good. and and it isn't all that good for every other artist that has come through history or is working today either. There are many, many pieces that every artist goes, I'm not quite so sure about that. That one might get put in a bin. Whereas other pieces are, out of sketches off the back of an envelope or something, or carefully cut out and taped into your sketchbook. So it's important to have realistic expectations and allow yourself just to enjoy the fun of drawing and painting, taking in a scene, trying to set up a composition that looks nice to you, but keep the pressure low. All right, composition exercise number 2. I am going to ask you to pause the video again when we come to the next picture. It is very cluttered, and I picked this particular photograph on purpose because, once again, this is sort of reality, isn't it? You go out to paint a beautiful scene and there are so many trees and things going on, you don't know where to start. Likewise with interior scenes, if you might have some photography or something of a person and there's all this other stuff, do you include it all in the scene or not? So when we look at this next picture, whether or not you're going to stop and do a sketch right now, what I want you to do is think, if I'm going to do a Notan and a small sketch of this, what is the story? What goes in? What goes out? How do I compose this scene? And where should I crop it? Because it's obviously too wide right now, or at least I think it's too wide. You may think it's perfect. Just our different interpretations as artists. So here we go. Let's have a look at it. So you can see right here a woman in probably her own home and surrounded by objects. So if you're going to be able to take the time to pause right here and have a look at this, have a really good look at this scene. If you were trying to tell the story that you see, what would go into that? And remember, you can move things around. You can move the lamp to the other side. You can change the number or the location of the things hanging up beside her, whatever you'd like to do. So if possible, take a moment, do a really quick study of light and dark, how you're going to arrange the scene, and then another quick sketch, moving things around or leaving them where they are, and showing how you're going to frame that scene. Now, sometimes you see, people like do, how is it? They do like this, trying to, create a scene for filmmaking and that kind of thing. So you're doing the same thing, but in your head, figuring out where the edges of the scene are and what goes in it. So take a little time if you can to do that, and then we'll move on to the next slide. And that next slide is another composition exercise. So that last one should have warmed you up pretty well. And here we go again. Same questions and same idea. Make a Notan and a small sketch. This is a very different scene, but likewise complicated. There's too much stuff in there. What I want you to do is to decide for yourself what is going on in this scene. How much do you want to include? This scene has 2 people in it, actually more than 2 people. You could have one person, both people. You could have all the people that you see in the scene. You could have some of the architecture, whatever it is that you want. But by deciding what you would like to have the scene about, maybe even writing down some words about what should be in this painting or drawing, decide what contributes to that story you're trying to tell, what can be left out, how to compose that scene, and how to crop it. So here we go. All right, so we've got these fellows, there's somebody in the background, there are more chairs, there are vending machines, there's some cool architecture. There are also some really good shadows underneath these chairs, which are definitely part of the scene and can be included in your Notan or sketch. So take a few minutes to figure out if you were presented with this as something from which to create a drawing or a painting. What would you decide to keep in, and what would you decide to take out? This is a really good exercise, and this one will take you a few minutes. So if you have the time to do it now, that's great. If not, come back to it, and we will move on to the next. Okay, to wrap up our talk on composition then, before we get started with this little list I have here, let me just reiterate. Composition is about what makes you interested about the scene that you're looking at. We live in a day where everyone's taking photos with their phone, with their DSLR camera, whatever they happen to have. And we have a tendency to want to just repeat on canvas or in our sketchbook exactly what the camera saw. And what I'd like you to do is interpret this scene the way you see it through your eyes, and get used to putting in, moving around, or taking out things that you do or don't want to have there. We don't need to be tied down to what the camera tells us about the scene. How often have you taken a photograph of something? Maybe when you were on vacation, you saw something amazing, and when you look at that photo later, it doesn't do justice to it. And sometimes it's distorted things or changed the depth of field in such a way that you feel really dilutes what you were looking at. So instead, take a few moments. You can take pictures, but take a few moments to do a little Notan, a little sketch of what you're looking at. It will put that real image in your head in a way that just taking a photo will never be able to do. It will allow you to recall the scene as it actually was, even if you're using the photo reference. So when I go and draw and paint people for portrait compositions, for example, for portrait commissions, I take that time to look at the person as they actually are and to sketch them. Not because I'm going to come up with some kind of masterpiece from that quick sketch, but because the time it has taken me to look really closely at the person, to record them in pencil, it sort of imprints on my mind what I was looking at and what I thought was interesting. So I am going to continue to encourage you to do that kind of sketching yourself. So draw and paint what makes you excited. If you see a scene that is a garbage can tipped over and you think that's interesting for some reason, maybe light and dark, who knows what's going on in the background, sketch it. You don't have to always go for that postcard scene. There can be something that you see in your everyday life that is really interesting for some reason that appeals to you. Likewise, when you set up a composition, a still life composition of objects that have meaning to you, you're creating art for yourself, and that's who you will always need to draw and paint for first. Not to impress somebody else, but to please something about your eye and how you view the world. So rely on your own innate sense of balance and organization. Just because I've shown you a few different ways to go about composing things today doesn't mean that I'm right or anybody else is right or wrong. You have to find what feels good to you. Some people love extremely balanced compositions. Other people love really asymmetrical compositions. It's up to you. I do want you to take the time and really look at the scene. Sometimes it's worth just sitting there for a few minutes before you get started and just looking around and saying to yourself, okay, what am I looking at here? Okay, I see 5 trees and I see a path down to the water and I see some boats in the distance and, oh, somebody is doing something interesting over there. And you might go, actually, that's kind of a more interesting composition. So taking a little time, rather than just running out to a field, setting up your plein air stuff and starting to paint, take a moment to take in that scene. Enjoy the time that you have drawing and painting. Also, as I've said before, edit and arrange to suit your purposes. If you are trying to do a very, very peaceful scene, and say, once again, it's a little boat out on the water or something like that, and here comes a larger boat through the scene, you don't have to include it in there. If it doesn't contribute to the peaceful scene that you were trying to draw or paint, leave it out. So that's completely up to you, the artist. All right, squint. Squinting always helps. Squint not only when you look at the scenes that you're going to draw, but also squint at artwork by others that you particularly like, and have a look at how they arrange the light and dark areas. How did they make it work? Where did they have the light fall on the object? How did they use light and dark contrast to lead your eye around the painting or the drawing? And a preliminary sketch. You can never go wrong with a preliminary sketch. And the reason for that is it gives you another opportunity to edit. It gives you a chance to look at the subject matter with even more detail, and also to plan out where the trouble bits are going to be. You know, going, I'm going to have a little bit of problem with that bridge. That's going to be difficult. Let me see if I can figure out the proportions here in my sketch, and then when I get to the painting, I won't be stumbling around. Okay, we covered an awful lot, but I hope that's helpful, because solid composition really and good design really are the cornerstones for everything that you're going to do in drawing and painting. And finding your own voice and your own way of expressing what you see through your artwork is all part and parcel of having fun and this crazy thing that we call art, drawing and painting. So I hope you have a very creative session following this and can take some of these ideas and go forward. If you didn't have a chance to stop the video and do those exercises, go ahead and come back to them. They really are valuable. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again soon.